Within the scope of content marketing and communication, where exactly does AI fit? Yeah, there are writing tools that if you write a few sentences, the AI will expand on that and write 3 paragraphs. And sure, that's cool, but at the end of the day, isn't it removing the human from a very human process? From the Soar Studios, this is the AI to Uplift Humanity podcast. I'm Justin Brady, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brad Miller, the co-founder of Puzzle. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Justin.
So you have a lot of experience in linguistics, understanding voice, understanding energy of voice, pacing, all this stuff. I have to admit, I had to Google your education. It's in what, linguistics something. I had to, how do you pronounce this word first?
Well, it depends on the way that you approach it, but I typically tell people I am a sociolinguist.
Yes.
Sociolinguistics is really the focus on social behavior and communication. So better understanding humans in social contexts and how they use language to get their ideas across.
Right. And I had to Google that because I was like, what? And by the way, the first time I asked Google Assistant, it totally face planted. And I told my wife, I was like, well, I guess Google has no idea what this is either. But then the second time around, it did figure it out. So one of the consistent themes I've seen looking at your LinkedIn posts, looking at your education, your past experience, we're just going to talk about humanity today, is much of your work of understanding people, understanding team dynamics involves something very simple. And I've heard this before, which is just go to the source. Like go to individuals. And so many times, especially with technology these days and how sophisticated it is, we just get our heads stuck in the data and in the systems and in the processes. But you really preach over and over, go to the source, get as close to the source as possible. And I'm assuming you preach this a lot because most teams don't do this?
Honestly, that's the absolute truth. You think about how teams work, especially AI teams, right? AI-focused teams, we're data scientists, and we like to focus on the data, numbers, bits, and zeros and ones.
Yeah.
It's amazing to be able to dive into a data set. But when you ultimately step back, each bit is an individual. Each data point is something that someone did to either index or point to or indicate something about themselves, the world around them, and their situation. So really what we're talking about is take a step back and look at the individuals, and then look at those individuals as a part of a larger group. You know, so many machine learning models especially, they focus on the mass of data, and you think about large data sets and you can talk about trillions of data points, but ultimately it comes down to an individual and what is right for that individual in that moment. And bringing it all together, we as humans, we're creative individuals and we change, right? We're not just static. We're not always the same. So sociolinguistics is helping me. It helps me and it helps my company better look at the individual and extract qualitative data and then convert that into quantitative data or quantifiable data so that we can ultimately help uplift humanity, in the words of this podcast.
Thanks for doing that. We didn't pay you to do that. So one of the breakthroughs kind of I had early on in my career, I was reading a book by Matthew May. I don't remember which one it was. Full disclosure, he let me write a little portion for one of his later books, The Laws of Subtraction. So I want to get that out there. But one of the things I was reading is... I think he worked with Toyota for some time, and one of their design principles was Genshi Jinbutsu, which basically means go look, go see. And it involves an exercise where like new people at Toyota, the CEO would draw a chalk circle around him and say, just watch. You know, just look at your surroundings and watch. And some of their breakthroughs came from this, right? So I thought that was brilliant at the time. And it involves just go talk to people, go watch, go, get out of the data, get out of the computer stuff and just go watch people. And here's the thing, like when we do that, I think everyone does that to some degree. They, by default, right? We can't not do that. We're observers. We watch patterns. And when we talk to people, when we talk to the customer, when we talk to the employee, we have these major breakthroughs. That's where the ideas come from. But yet we never pick up on that pattern and we just go right back to the data. Is this just laziness because we can pull it up on our computer? Or is there a deeper, seriously, I can just Google something and pull it up. Or is there a deeper problem?
I think it's a deeper problem, right? The laziness isn't so much that, it's not so much laziness, I would rather say. It's more distrust. So if we look at a data set that is qualitative, if you look at an interview, for example, or a focus group, or when I used to work at Procter & Gamble, we would go into people's homes and we would literally sit down and talk with them, and that was great. But the default reaction was, oh, that's anecdotal evidence.
Interesting.
And because it was one data point, or perceived as one data point, when in reality there were thousands, millions of data points in that one individual interaction, but it was one human, it was one sample, right? And so that's where people really get caught up. They get worried that a sample size n equals 1 is not sufficient for statistical significance. Well, that may be true if you're thinking about that n equals 1 as one data point. But if you think about that n equals 1 as millions of data points, suddenly you start realizing that there could be significance here, maybe within the context of that one human, but there's still significance. Yeah. And so sociolinguistics helps me step back and say, okay, it might be n equals 1. It might just be one human that I'm interacting with in this moment. But if that human is similar to hundreds of thousands of other humans, I can extract some meaningful insights from that. I can look at them and say, that might be indicative of a larger problem.
Yeah, okay, that's really good. And I would point out, you're actually the perfect guy to talk to about this, but I would point out, it's not one data point, right? Like when you're talking with someone, maybe for the untrained person, it might be one data point, but it's not really one data point. Past guest, Joseph Nelson, he's the CEO of RoboFlow, talked about in-person communication. He talked about it as high bandwidth communication, which yes. I love that. And that's what everyone forgets, is that it's not one data point. It's like thousands of data points because your mind is picking up on all this stuff. Body language, what you do, linguistics, tone, energy, pacing. It's millions upon millions of data points. Yes. It's just kind of hard to communicate that to your boss, though, when you need to pull a report together.
Exactly. The concept of information theory essentially says it's the ability to package information, transmit that information, and then decode that information. I mean, if you boil it down to the simplest terms of it. And so what you're saying is being able to take what is fundamentally human, that ability to create and make meaning out of the world around you, encode it, transmit that encoding, and then have it interpretable by an audience. And so that's what we're doing at Puzzle, is really helping people be their best selves, create, understand those millions of data points, that high bandwidth communication, and being able to bring that and extract the meaningful moments of that and transmit that in a meaningful way to a larger audience.
Right. So I wanted to talk about Puzzle a little later, but I want to get into it now because it fits with what we're talking about now. So what is, go ahead and give that, just so we have an overview, give like that 15-second elevator pitch for what Puzzle is. And then I have some questions based on that answer you just gave. Absolutely.
So ultimately, Puzzle is helping design the future of content operations. Now, content operations is this phrase that not very many people talk about. You might see content management or asset management, or, there are other areas that talk about this. But ultimately, what Puzzle does is help us focus back on what is most important, which is humanity, right? We are defined by our ability to create. And so content creation is that thing that we find very valuable, especially in companies, being able to create something of value for the company. But the tools that our current employees, our workforce uses, are tedious. They're really robbing us of our ability to have time for creativity. So what Puzzle does, it's an artificial intelligence that helps consolidate the content marketing process into 3 simple steps. There's build, review, and boost. So the machine learning tools and these integrations that we've built into it, it helps transform your company's content marketing team and really help them make their greatest impact on both the top and the bottom lines. So now you can build higher quality content, you can review it faster. It removes all of the tedious parts of content creation and allows you to have greater accuracy and ultimately boost your brand's equity through impactful content marketing.
Okay, so this is perfect because in my mind, my non-AI mind, I have a kind of probably a better understanding than most, but not as much as you do or like an engineer. The tedious part of content marketing is what we described like a few minutes ago, which is the spend intimate time with people and take that anecdotal data and amplify it to a larger audience because it's probably a pattern, right? And so this is like one of the I've talked about this quite a bit on other channels, but this is one of the really easy methods I teach to my clients, which is, I just call it the notebook method, which is go listen to your customers, write down all the questions they ask, and then create content that answers those questions. It's assuming that if someone's asking you, there are probably thousands of people across the world asking, the massive Google, right? And like, I think Google themselves said 15% of queries every day, or is it every week? I can't remember, are new queries that have never been searched before. So in my mind, that's the bulk, right? That's the hard work. So how do you use AI to connect what I consider to be a very human characteristic of content marketing? And how do you use AI to speed that process up? It seems to me completely impossible, at least right now.
Actually, I would argue that the most difficult part, I would say the most tedious part of all of this is not necessarily the research, but rather it's the taking of that information and rephrasing it and putting it into 15 different ways and modifying it and updating it and making sure that it's right for the audience. So it's not necessarily capturing the information, it's the process of digesting that information and simplifying it. So take a blog post, for example. If you take a blog post, the creative part can take time, right? It's especially if it's a technical blog post where you're writing out a how-to guide on something that's highly technical. As a subject matter expert, you might sit down and you think through 15 different ways to process that. That's what you are best known for because you are a subject matter expert. So you write out your blog post, but what the tedious part is actually extracting the SEO keywords, rewording that so that it works for LinkedIn versus Twitter versus where you post your blog. It's taking all of the rework and automating that, taking that rework and allowing you to collaborate better in instances where you collaborate or to do it individually and not have to worry about the accuracy of your information.
Okay, so this is really good because I asked the question thinking that there was no way, Dr. Miller, you could get out of this one. I have you trapped. No, that's not the point of the podcast, obviously, but it is a burning question I had. And as you're answering it, I'm like, oh my word, he's absolutely right. Because as you indicate, and this is what I do for a living. Right? So as you indicate, the tough part, the part that really requires the human brain to be fully functional, the what some may call anecdotal part, which I think has the most value, high bandwidth conversation. Thank you, Joseph Nelson. That's the part that's very, very hard. I would argue right now, at least, I'm sure you probably would too. You can say, hey, wait, if you think I'm wrong, but that's the part that's hard for AI. But the part that my brain kind of starts to shut off and, it kind of goes on autopilot is exactly what you described, which is now I have this great content. I know what I want to say. I've even written the whole thing, but now I have to adjust it for SEO. Now, I have to get the keywords in the right spot. Now I have to adjust it for LinkedIn. Now I have to do all this kind of what I would consider a process that should be automated because it feels kind of brainless, but computers aren't smart enough to do it. So that's where you're saying your company Puzzle kind of fills that gap. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The concept of deep work, as first coined by Cal Newport, I really appreciate all of his work. But what Cal Newport says is that deep work is something that's valuable, rare, and meaningful. And so if you think about you as a content creator or any of your audience or anyone who might be listening to this, you are a content creator. You create something valuable, meaningful, and rare. And in so doing, why focus on all of this shallow work stuff? Why spend all of your time going back and forth and making sure that the approvals are accurate, and making sure that you're getting those approvals, and making sure that your content is accurate, and making sure that it's less than 280 characters for Twitter, and making sure, all of these steps.
I hate that stuff.
Right? These are steps that are not your greatest contribution to humanity. Let's be honest. Yeah. And so what Puzzle's doing is saying, okay, you have a great contribution to make. Why not focus on that and let us take the rest off of your plate?
Because obviously the difficulty here is, and I'm sure this is part of your process, right? But obviously the difficulty here is knowing the handoff point. Where do we hand off great original content creation to an AI? Because one of the things that my clients eat, like bigger companies that are like 80 times their size, they eat them for lunch. They just eat them for breakfast because those companies are nose deep in all their data and their tools, like from an SEO standpoint, like SEMrush and Ahrefs, and those tools are great. But then my clients just take their very original and unique perspective. We combine my team's ability to write in a very human way that triggers an emotional reaction, and with like a fraction of the budget, we just obliterate these other companies because we can write to other humans. Yes. So where's that? Part of me is a little worried, and maybe other content marketers are too. They're like, I don't really want to put these incredible human ideas and this incredible writing opportunity to truly hit someone in the heart. I don't know if I want to hand that off to an AI who might look at patterns from the past and patterns on the internet, try to replicate those patterns and ruin the uniqueness. I think that would be the concern. How do you address that?
Justin, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said that the majority of Google searches are brand new.
Right.
We are creative beings, right? And so the focus doesn't need to be on creating for us. That's not what I want. I don't want anything to create anything for me. What I want to be able to do is create and then let it handle the process after the creation, right? This is why GitHub has been so powerful for developers, because GitHub gives you this ability to really pull in data and then decide. There's parent data and child data, and I can decide which information is flowing in which direction, but it's ultimately me deciding and saying, is this something I can merge with my parent data, for example? So GitHub's power lies in the ability to have versions. And that versioning process is something that we have built into Puzzle as well. We don't want to replace the creative. We don't even want to pretend to be the creative, right? What we're trying to do is help you create that parent content, and then we can show you some versions. And those versions might change over time if you decide to change your parent content. You change the parent content, and that will update your additional versions. So let's say you need a new tweet. Well, remix the existing content and create a new tweet, because my old content dies very quickly.
Right.
This versioning process allows for you to create something, have a library of content that is yours, not housed in anyone else's warehouse. This is your content. And then being able to learn from that content. This is the Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr. quote, history is a great teacher. Right? Why are we ignoring all of the content that we have created years and years and years ago, or months and months and months ago? Why not ask, can I reuse this? I'm not reinventing the wheel here. Nobody's reinventing the wheel. We're just remixing.
Yeah. So would you say we don't have a solution problem? Like history repeats itself. And then there's like that great scripture, like there's nothing new under the sun. I'm oversimplifying it, right? But would you say one of the biggest problems we have is not fixing problems, but finding the solutions that already exist?
It's finding the solutions that already exist and improving the process for finding those solutions.
Yeah. I mean, I think that process, I'll ask this in the form of a question. That would probably be better. Do teams kind of rely on technology to fix what is a process problem?
We do, but we have this maximalist approach, unfortunately. Most teams say, I need an additional tool to fix my problem. And so they add in additional tools and they keep building and building and building. And you have to fit the integrations and make sure that those tools continue to work well with each other. And if there's an update on one of my tools, perhaps it stops working with another one of my tools. So the process problem is one of maximalism. What we need to instead adopt is this idea of minimalism. Right? This is a digital minimalist. And again, going back to Cal Newport, he's one of my favorite authors. But he wrote this book called Digital Minimalism, which essentially says, take the craftsman approach and find the tool that best suits your need. And if your need is in creating better content, then find a tool that does that. But if your problem is in the process, then find a tool that can do that. And that's what Puzzle's trying to build, is this ability to improve the overall process so that you can focus on that creativity piece, that thing that you're best at, and let the process work itself out.
It basically sounds like what you're saying is the success of Puzzle will depend on your ability to get that handoff correct and to not diminish the humanity of content.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask about some of the stuff like technology in and of itself. But I have millions of questions on how you're going to figure all this out to get it into an AI, right? I mean, that's the same questions I have for pretty much any PhD AI person. But like, let's go back to your background, because one of the things that AI is going to have to figure out in this whole process is the value of words. And that sounds really kind of silly when I say it that way. But I just wrote like a LinkedIn post about this a few days ago on how one of the things I really picked up on years ago after watching a TV show, really, it was Lie to Me. I'm not sure if you've heard this TV show,
yes.
But it's based on an actual dude, Paul Ekman, who learned about micro expressions and basically how to read people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, I thought it was a bunch of bunk. And then I looked it up. I'm like, oh, this is sciencey stuff. Like, this is real. And so from that, I started listening and really paying attention to people's word choice and why they chose to use certain words. Like, I probably can't come up with a lot of examples right now, but I feel instead of I know, stuff like that. Yeah. Like, why would you say it that way? Or why would you address that in past tense, like instead of current? Like, did this person leave the company? Is this a project that you're going to kill or you've already killed in your mind? So over time, I picked up the power of word choice, and the words people choose to use matter a great deal. But I don't even think humans are listening to these words. I don't think humans are paying attention. Can an AI help us do that? Can technology help us do that?
One of my master's theses was focused on this question in particular. I was asking the question, can you identify serial innovators within large corporations? And the ability to identify somebody who maybe has never met another person of a similar category. So you don't have the contact, right? You don't start, typically in linguistics, we like to refer to it as the ability to mimic others, right? You grow up in a particular environment and you speak in a very specific way based on that environment that you grew up in.
Right.
Well, there is this other element that I showed in my thesis, which is we also communicate based on the way we think, the way that we look at the world. And serial innovators, right, in this particular example, they approach the world in a very particular way. And you can actually show and you can extract what that focus is by looking at the words that they use. So this is the meaning behind the words, right?
Wow.
And so a serial innovator will, one of my most favorite examples is that they are more likely to get arrested.
What? Okay. All right. You got to expand on that now.
A serial innovator is someone who looks at the rules and decides whether or not to obey them. And if they feel like there is an ethical, moral dilemma at stake, they will take the ethical, moral high ground and they will choose to disobey the rule.
Sure. I can totally see that. I might have a little bit of that inside me. Definitely not the arrested part because it's too inconvenient, but that's absolutely fascinating. Are there any other patterns that you identified?
Oh, yeah. Focus
outside
on money.
Of the ability to get arrested?
Focus on money. right? A serial innovator doesn't care so much about the funding and whether or not how much money we have. They care more about the ability to get something done.
Yeah.
Cost what it costs. Another thing that they really focused on was teamwork. A serial innovator, unfortunately, tends to be a little more of a lone wolf. And so these individuals will talk more about me, I, when talking about their greatest innovations, because they're not as well understood.
Huh.
So if you think about going back and thinking about the power of words that we use, the AI can identify patterns easily. That's one of the strengths of machine learning, right? Is being able to identify patterns. Those patterns, being able to extract the meaningful parts of those patterns, that's human. And so what we try to do is we try to, in the AI that Puzzle is creating, we are helping focus on the process, the patterns of the process, improving those patterns of the process, streamlining the patterns of those processes, and ultimately allowing the human, both us and our customers, to be able to focus on that meaning behind the patterns.
That's crazy. Okay, that's kind of crazy. That's so like you can tell all this stuff by just the word selection someone uses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
wild.
What's interesting is that's kind of been the focus for a long time, focusing on word count. And it's not necessarily the whole picture, though. You talked about high bandwidth communication, right? And the words that I use, yes, they're a part of it, but it's also the way in which I use it. It's the context around which I've used those words. It's the body positioning. It's what I was wearing. It's the temperature around me. It's everything within that context. And being able to extract meaning from all of that is really what humans are best at.
Right. And I would say they don't even know it, right? Like they just call it a gut feeling. And that's the sad thing about this anecdotal data collection is people write it off as, well, I just had an emotional feeling. That didn't matter. And I'm like, well, but okay, but that emotional feeling came from somewhere. Yes. Like there's a reason you developed that emotion. There's a reason you had that reaction. It's because you're really good at pattern recognition, but those little subconscious areas of the brain don't bother your prefrontal cortex with that stuff, right? Your hippocampus and your amygdala don't bother alerting the prefrontal cortex because it'll overwhelm it. And so you are collecting tons of data like you just described, but people write it off as, well, it's just your personal opinion. Well, sure, but if we extract why they developed that personal opinion, there's a lot of value there. So is there a way, and I have one more question before this, so this might be a fast answer, but is there just an easy way we can all be better humans by doing this stuff? Is it as simple as just being more observant, or is there a quick process that we can all go through to be like superhuman listeners?
I wish we could all be superhuman listeners. I genuinely believe that we can become better at listening and understanding individuals and in the communications that we have, but it takes removing that shallow work from our plate, right? We spend a lot of time in the system. Sit at your desk, stand in line, follow the rules, listen carefully. It starts from a very early age, and that's what we've been trained to do. It beats the creativity out of us. It beats the ability, to listen and to stay focused on what is most meaningful and most important in the moment. So in linguistics, we talk about this concept of frameworks. And the best analogy for this is you're standing inside of a room and you look outside of a window, and the reality that you see in front of you is composed of whatever you can see through that window, that frame. Well, in artificial intelligence, we have this same concept, which is the ability to divide data structures into stereotypes. That everything housed within this stereotypical frame, that is what I'm going to be looking at. Well, the human likes to look outside the box if we're not too stifled by the system, I should add.
That's a good addition.
And so the best way that we can become good at listening is by removing all of these systematic things from our plates and spending more time being bored.
That's interesting.
Spend more time just listening, just being. Next time you're standing in a line instead of pulling out your phone.
Yes.
Let's say you're pulling out, you're standing in line and you're going to buy your groceries. And instead of pulling out your phone as you're waiting, what if you just observed? What if you just looked around you? You know, I used to do some coaching with individuals and I would have them sit with me. Literally, this is pre-COVID, obviously. And we would sit in a very public space and I would have them look at a group and I would say, who's the leader there?
Mm.
And you can tell, the longer you look, the longer you observe, you train yourself to be able to pay attention to these types of things. And you can tell who the leader is in the context of the conversation happening at that moment.
It's so true. And people miss this stuff all the time. Like, just by experience, definitely not your experience. I can't imagine what you see. But just based on my own primitive experience, I would call it, it is incredible the amount of data and information you can pick up by doing exactly what you said. Put your stinking phone down. Get rid of the distractions and just listen with your eyes, listen with your ears. Don't hear words, like hear intent, hear like frustration. Try to hear all that stuff. It's incredible the amount of data you can pick up. All right, Dr. Miller, I got to talk to the listeners really quickly here, but can you stick with us a little bit? I really want to ask you if the future of AI and technology can get us to a point where all technology just kind of vanishes. Can you stick with me for a bit?
Absolutely.
All right, listener, you and I need to have a talk. We need to have a talk. I know if you're a content creator, if you have like a lot of cool video assets, you have a really large library of incredible content, and you don't exactly know how to organize all of it. You know there's that one guy or that one lady that spoke about that one thing in one of the videos, and you have literally no idea how to find it. That's why you should try AI video search. Because with one keyword search, you can search the entire library in under a second, and it shows you every time that key phrase was mentioned with a transcript right at the exact timestamp, so you can just hit play. It's incredible. You can try it out at soar.com/video search. Soar.com/video search. We're still joined with Dr. Brad Miller, CEO of Puzzle. And before I let you go, I have this burning question for you about something you wrote. I think it was on LinkedIn. And AI engineers seem to diverge. Like, I'm seeing a pattern. AI engineers, AI people seem to diverge in their tech understanding from like other developers and IT folks kind of in this regard. They tend to believe in like a minimal technological footprint, whereas everyone else sees like screens everywhere and we're all going to live in the metaverse. Is the future of AI the minimization or the minimalism of technology?
That is a wonderful question. I think that the potential of artificial intelligence is really augmentation of humanity. Screens do a wonderful job of removing us from humanity. And you think of a Zoom call, for example. Someone hops onto a call and it's a very two-dimensional, and this was the conversation that you had earlier in an earlier podcast. I remember listening to this. It's not high bandwidth, right? Artificial intelligence needs to augment those high bandwidth communication moments. It needs to be able to allow us to simplify the tedious and augment that high bandwidth. Really, artificial intelligence is essentially linguistics in computational form. I like to think of linguistics as being everywhere and all pervasive, but it's being able to look at communication, find the patterns, find and extract those patterns, and then ultimately allow me to focus on the most important piece.
Right. So do you think we'll ever see like no screens, no billboards, no stoplights, no nothing, just like green grass and humanity and simplicity? Do you think we can get there?
I would like to think so.
Me too.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough. I don't think that we have enough ethical behavioral scientists focused on building those AI systems.
Interesting.
Yet.
Interesting.
I think that, doctors have the Hippocratic Oath. Attorneys have an oath in many of the states in the United States. They have this oath that is required in order to practice law. College students will take a code of ethics when they enter the university. Financial sector has codes of ethics. Why not data science? Why not tech companies?
Sure.
Why not AI developers, right? There are some that are trying to put out some models of ethical focus, but ultimately they're just trying to build a better widget.
Right.
Build something that more people will buy.
Yeah.
And if we take a step back and ask, okay, if we're thinking ethically, what a behavioral scientist says is understanding, they try to understand human behavior. So if AI is going to uplift humanity, what we desperately need is we need to better understand humanity. We need to build tools that help us achieve our very best, not take stuff away from us, not replace us, but augment and help us achieve our very best.
Interesting. Dr. Brad Miller, CEO and co-founder of Puzzle, thank you so much for coming on the show and helping me and the listeners uplift humanity.
Thank you very much, Justin. It's been a pleasure.
And hey, thanks for listening today. This is the AI to Uplift Humanity podcast.